On a warm Saturday morning in late August of 2008, the small-town farm market was alive with the usual rhythm of chatter, vendors calling out prices, and families weaving through the aisles. Among them was 23-year-old Claire, a young woman known in her community for her gentle nature and her tendency to always be on time. She had told her parents she was only stopping at the market briefly to pick up a few things before meeting friends later in the afternoon. It was meant to be a simple errand, the kind of everyday task that passes without notice. Instead, it became the moment her entire life was swallowed by mystery. Witnesses later recalled Claire moving between the fruit stands and bakery stalls, carrying a reusable bag and chatting briefly with a vendor she seemed to know. No one noticed anything unusual. She looked calm, her pace unhurried. By all accounts, she was planning a normal day. But the details become haunting in retrospect, because no one can pinpoint the exact moment she was last truly seen. Hours later, her car would still be parked in the gravel lot, sitting untouched as though frozen in time. Her parents grew concerned when she failed to arrive at her friend's house that afternoon. Claire was not the type to flake on plans. Calls to her phone went unanswered, each one ringing into silence. By evening, when the sun dipped low over the cornfields and the market vendors had long since packed away their goods, the car remained where she had left it. Inside, her purse sat neatly on the passenger seat, containing her wallet, identification, and cash. Even her keys were still in the ignition. To the family, it was as though she had stepped out for a brief moment and simply vanished into thin air. The first hours of her disappearance were filled with disbelief. Her friends assumed she had been delayed. Her parents called around asking if anyone had seen her. As night fell, worry turned to dread. The sheriff's office was notified, and deputies drove out to the lot with flashlights, walking the perimeter and calling her name into the darkness. The market was deserted now, reduced to an empty stretch of gravel and the faint smell of hay drifting from the nearby barns. The silence was heavy, unnatural, broken only by the crunch of boots on stone. The search began with the basics. Officers checked the car for signs of forced entry but found none. The interior was undisturbed, no scuff marks, no broken glass, no blood. Her purse still contained money, ruling out robbery as the obvious motive. There was no sign of a struggle in the immediate area. The first conclusion was unsettling. If Claire had been taken, it was done swiftly, with no one noticing, in broad daylight. Word spread quickly through the small community. By the following morning, volunteers were combing through nearby fields, while dogs were brought in to search for a scent trail. For a time, hope held steady. People reassured themselves that perhaps she had gotten lost or injured and would be found resting against a tree waiting for help. But the dogs lost her scent at the edge of the parking lot, as though she had stepped off the gravel and dissolved into the air. That detail would become the first fracture in the case, raising grim possibilities that were difficult to voice. For her family, the reality set in slowly. Claire's father drove back to the market repeatedly in the days that followed, standing near her car, staring at it as though the vehicle itself might give him an answer. Her mother clung to the idea that Claire might still walk back through the door at any moment, alive but shaken, apologizing for the fright. Yet with each passing hour, the unanswered questions grew louder. How could a young woman simply disappear from a place so familiar, so public, without anyone noticing? Detectives interviewed vendors who had been working that day. Most remembered Claire passing by, smiling politely, exchanging small talk. No one reported an argument, no shouting, no abrupt departure. A few recalled a dark-colored pickup parked near the lot's entrance, but details were hazy. The timing was uncertain, the driver unseen. Investigators logged it as a lead but could not confirm whether it was significant or coincidence. By the end of that week, the case had already taken on an unnerving character. There were no ransom calls, no suspicious activity on Claire's bank cards, and no record of her traveling anywhere. It was as if her life had been severed at the moment she left the market aisle. To law enforcement, this was one of the most troubling types of disappearances, one without evidence, one that left no trail to follow. The town's sense of safety began to fracture. Parents watched their children more closely. Market vendors whispered about who might be responsible. their eyes darting toward neighbors who suddenly seemed unfamiliar. Rumors grew quickly, fueled by fear. Some speculated about human trafficking, others about a local predator hiding in plain sight. Everyone had theories, but no one had answers. 17 years later, people would look back on that morning at the farm market as the last time anyone saw Claire alive. A day meant for shopping and laughter became the foundation of a mystery that held an entire town hostage. And although the search would eventually quiet and the years would pass, her car sitting abandoned with her purse still inside would remain one of the most haunting images of the case. It was the first sign that what had happened to Claire was not an accident or misunderstanding, but something darker, something that would remain buried in silence until much later, when the cellar of a nearby farm would finally give up its secret. The morning after Claire's disappearance, the quiet farmland surrounding the market was transformed into the center of a desperate search. Her family stood among clusters of neighbors and strangers, all of them stepping forward to comb the fields and wooded trails. Volunteers spread out across the rolling acres, calling her name into the wind, their voices echoing through barns and rustling cornfields. It was the kind of response small communities are known for, swift, heartfelt, and determined. But as hours turned into days, the vastness of the countryside felt overwhelming, as though the land itself was swallowing the truth. Law enforcement mobilized quickly. Patrol cars lined the gravel lot, and deputies coordinated search grids while state troopers brought in canine units. The dogs picked up Claire's scent near her abandoned car, noses pressed to the ground, tails stiff as they followed the invisible trail toward the edge of the market. But then, without warning, the dogs faltered. Their heads lifted, spinning in confusion. The scent simply stopped at the gravel's edge, as though Claire had stepped off the earth itself. Handlers tried again, circling the area, but the result was the same. Her trail evaporated within just a few feet. Helicopters swept across the farmland, their blades chopping through the air as spotters scanned for any sign of clothing, movement, or disturbance in the brush. The aerial view offered only a patchwork of fields and barns, endless green with no answers. On the ground, search parties waded through ditches, opened abandoned sheds, and knocked on farmhouse doors. Farmers who had known Claire since childhood welcomed officers onto their land, but began to grow uneasy as questions turned more pointed. The search stretched on through the week. Families brought food to volunteers, and posters with Claire's photograph appeared on every telephone pole and gas station window. Each new effort was fueled by hope, but beneath that hope was a gnawing dread that something irreversible had already happened. Claire's parents moved mechanically through the chaos, their grief contained but raw. Her father insisted on joining every field line, his eyes scouring the ground with an urgency that spoke to the fear building inside him. Her mother, meanwhile, kept returning to the market lot, standing by the empty car as though guarding it from erasure. By the fourth day, frustration began to seep into the atmosphere. Without physical evidence, detectives had little to go on. They interviewed vendors and shoppers again, pressing for forgotten details. Some recalled seeing a truck parked oddly close to the lot's exit, its driver lingering, but descriptions were vague. Others spoke about Claire smiling at a vendor she seemed to know, though no one could remember who she spoke with last. Every lead dissolved into uncertainty, and every uncertain answer added weight to the growing sense of futility. As investigators scrambled for direction, speculation began to ripple through the community. The market was tight-knit, with most vendors and regular shoppers knowing each other by name. But that familiarity only intensified suspicion. Was the abductor a stranger passing through, or someone who had been standing in the same aisles as Claire, blending in among friends and neighbors? People who had once exchanged recipes and small talk now eyed each other with unease. Rumors began quietly, but spread quickly. Some whispered about drifters who passed through town during harvest season. Others pointed fingers at young men with troubled pasts who worked on nearby farms. Even casual acquaintances who had once seemed harmless were suddenly scrutinized. The fear was not only of what had happened, but of who could have done it and whether they were still walking among them. The sheriff's department tried to quell the speculation, urging patience, but behind closed doors, investigators were equally divided. Stranger abductions were rare in rural areas, and the neat placement of her belongings inside the car suggested something more deliberate. At the same time, no evidence tied any single person to her disappearance. Each day without answers left the community more fractured, with neighbors mistrusting neighbors and families looking over their shoulders in ways they never had before. Despite the growing unease, the search persisted. Creeks were dredged, abandoned wells checked, and wooded trails walked over and over again until paths were worn bare. Volunteers dwindled as weeks stretched on, but Claire's family refused to stop. They pushed through exhaustion, convinced that the next sweep might reveal the clue everyone else had overlooked. Yet the land gave nothing back. By the end of the second week, the scale of the failure was undeniable. The helicopters left, the search dogs were recalled, and official operations scaled down. What remained was a family still searching, a town still whispering, and an absence that felt heavier with each passing day. Claire's case had shifted from an urgent search to a puzzle with missing pieces, and for investigators, one troubling truth became clear. If the answers weren't out in the fields or woods, they might lie in the lives of the people who surrounded her. It was in that silence, as the community began to fracture under the weight of suspicion, that detectives turned their attention away from the land and toward the people who had been at the market that morning. And in doing so, they would uncover unsettling secrets that blurred the line between bystander and suspect, leading the investigation down darker, more personal paths. Detectives soon shifted their attention from the search fields to the people who had been at the market that morning. If Claire had not simply wandered away, then someone had taken her. And if it wasn't a stranger who vanished into the wind, it had to be someone close enough to the market to move unnoticed in plain sight. As they revisited witness accounts, two names rose repeatedly from the haze of rumor and speculation, names that pointed to men who had lived and worked in the orbit of the farm stalls for years. The first was a farmhand in his early 30s, employed sporadically on different properties around town. He was known for drinking heavily and fighting often, leaving behind a record of bar altercations and one dismissed charge of assault. Though he never held steady employment, he often picked up shifts helping vendors load and unload produce at the Saturday market. Witnesses placed him at the lot that morning, though opinions varied on whether he interacted directly with Claire. His reputation made him an easy target for suspicion, and detectives leaned in quickly. He was brought in for questioning, where his temper flared at the accusations. He admitted to being at the market, but insisted he left early, claiming he had gone home to sleep off a hangover. His alibi came from his mother, who told police he had been at her house by noon. The timing was close enough to raise doubts, but not solid enough to eliminate him from the investigation. The second lead was more subtle, but perhaps more unsettling. A vendor in his 40s, known for selling baked goods, had often been seen talking with Claire on market days. Multiple witnesses described him as friendly, too friendly, some suggested, with a tendency to hover around her stall. One woman recalled noticing how his eyes followed Claire when she passed, and another remembered him offering to help her carry bags even when she declined. When questioned, he admitted he had spoken with her that morning, claiming their interaction had been casual and brief. He said he left the market at his usual time, returning to his farm to prepare for a delivery. His wife corroborated the story, though detectives noted how carefully aligned their statements seemed, as if rehearsed. Both men remained under a cloud of suspicion. Detectives compared their timelines, searching for inconsistencies, but the leads refused to converge. The farmhand's history of violence made him dangerous, but his alibi, shaky though it was, placed him away from the market before Claire was thought to have vanished. The vendor's mannerisms raised alarm, yet no evidence linked him directly to the car, the purse, or the vanishing itself. Each man seemed plausible on the surface, and yet both appeared to slip just out of reach whenever investigators pressed for certainty. Theories multiplied quickly, each one fueled by fear and desperation. Some believed Claire had been lured by someone she trusted, convinced to walk with them to a vehicle parked just out of sight. Others whispered about human trafficking rings targeting rural markets, preying on isolated women before vanishing across county lines. Jealousy was raised as a motive too, the suggestion that someone infatuated with her might have acted violently when rejected. With no physical evidence, every possibility felt viable, and every lead seemed to dissolve in contradiction. Her family listened to these developments with growing anguish. For them, each new suspect offered a fleeting glimpse of hope, the idea that the truth might finally be named, but every time investigators circled back to report, the result was the same. There was no proof. Claire's father grew frustrated with the pace of the case, openly questioning why the farmhand wasn't charged or why the vendor wasn't followed more closely. Her mother retreated inward, refusing to believe either man could be the one, instead clinging to the hope that Claire might still be alive somewhere, beyond the reach of the investigation. Meanwhile, detectives pressed deeper into the details. They analyzed phone records, interviewed co-workers, and scrutinized the men's vehicles. Nothing suspicious was uncovered. No fibers, no blood, no fingerprints. The trail was as empty as the gravel lot where her car had been found. Forensic teams combed through both men's properties, searching barns and sheds, but every space came up clean. The lack of evidence frustrated investigators, leaving them torn between two paths that both seemed convincing, but neither provable. Months passed with little progress. Public opinion split down the middle, with some convinced the violent farmhand had finally escalated, while others believed the overly attentive vendor had hidden his true nature behind charm. Families who once greeted one another at church began to whisper behind closed doors, and the market itself grew quieter as shoppers carried unease along with their groceries. The disappearance had not only stolen Claire, but it also planted suspicion in the soil of the community, dividing people who had once trusted one another completely. In the end, both men remained suspects, but neither was charged. Their names lingered in reports and rumors, the kind that resurfaced at every anniversary vigil, keeping the community locked in a cycle of blame and doubt. And as the months turned to years, the focus of the investigation shifted away from individuals and toward broader, more unsettling possibilities. If the truth wasn't hidden in these men, then perhaps it lay in something larger, a network, a chance encounter, or an entirely different kind of predator. But as the official search cooled, Claire's family refused to let go. They carried the weight of every unanswered question, clinging to the belief that somewhere, somehow, a clue still existed that would explain what had happened in those final moments after she walked through the aisles of the farm market. And though the suspects would fade in and out of attention over the years, the lack of a body, a weapon, or closure meant one thing. The nightmare was far from over. In the months after Claire's disappearance, the frantic energy of the search gave way to a quieter, more enduring form of desperation. Her parents, unwilling to let her name fade into silence, threw themselves into the work of keeping her case alive. They appeared on local television, pleading for tips. They printed thousands of flyers, taped them to gas station pumps, grocery store doors, and every telephone pole in town. At night, they organized candlelight vigils where neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder, holding flickering lights that swayed in the wind, while her mother clutched a framed photograph of her daughter. For a time, those gatherings felt like a promise that as long as people kept showing up, Claire's story wouldn't be forgotten. A reward fund was started, the figure growing each year as donations trickled in from sympathetic strangers. Her father spoke at town meetings, urging residents to search their barns, their fields, even their ditches one more time, just in case something had been missed. He was tireless, driving miles to hand out flyers at rest stops and truck plazas, convinced that perhaps she had been taken far from home and that someone, somewhere, had seen her face. Each action was born from a mix of hope and torment, the need to do something in the face of unbearable stillness. But behind the public campaigns, the family's private world grew heavier. Claire's room remained untouched, her belongings frozen in the moment she had left for the market. Birthdays and holidays passed with an empty chair at the table, each occasion amplifying the silence. Her father's grief hardened into suspicion. He began to look at the people around him differently, wondering if someone who still walked freely in the community held the truth. Conversations at the grocery store or gas station carried a new weight, his eyes searching for the slightest hesitation, the faintest flicker of guilt. He returned again and again to the idea that the market, the place where Claire had vanished, held secrets that no one wanted to reveal. Detectives continued to pursue tips, but the leads dwindled, and those that did arrive led only to disappointment. A hiker found a discarded piece of clothing deep in the woods, but testing revealed it wasn't hers. A neighbor reported seeing a truck matching the description of the suspicious vehicle weeks after the disappearance, but it led nowhere. Each call raised hope and then crushed it again, leaving the family more fragile with every cycle. As months became years, the case grew cold. Detectives were reassigned, and eventually some retired, carrying with them fragments of a story that had never reached an ending. The family's distrust deepened. At vigils, Claire's father spoke not only of hope, but also of his conviction that people in town knew more than they admitted. His words unsettled some, but others shared his unease. Rumors persisted about vendors who had moved away quietly, about workers who had left jobs abruptly, about doors that seemed too firmly closed when police came asking questions. Nothing could be proven, yet suspicion lingered in the air, dividing neighbors who once trusted one another without hesitation. Through it all, Claire's mother held a different kind of vigil. She resisted her husband's darker suspicions, clinging instead to the fragile possibility that Claire might still be alive. She wrote letters to her daughter every year, leaving them sealed in a box, convinced that one day she might have the chance to hand them over. She avoided conversations about death, refusing to use past tense when speaking of Claire. For her, admitting to the worst possibility felt like a second betrayal, as if giving up hope would mean giving up on her child entirely. The passage of time brought cruel milestones, 5 years, 10 years, 17 years. Each anniversary carried with it a painful balance between remembrance and the quiet acknowledgement that answers might never come. News coverage dwindled, the reward money sat untouched, and the case file, once the focus of constant review, slipped into storage, gathering dust. For law enforcement, Claire's name became another cold entry in a long list of unresolved disappearances. For her parents, it remained the wound they woke to each morning and carried into every night. Yet beneath the silence, her father never let go of his belief that the truth remained close, buried within the same community where she had last been seen. He spoke often of the market and its surrounding farms, insisting that if investigators ever returned with fresh eyes, they might find what had been overlooked. His conviction bordered on obsession, driving wedges between himself and old friends who grew weary of his suspicion. Still, he clung to it, because it was the only path that made sense in the absence of evidence. And then, in a cruel twist of fate, time itself became the key that would eventually unearth what detectives and volunteers had missed. For years, the family endured the torment of silence, the endless repetition of unanswered questions. They held their vigils, renewed their campaigns, and carried their grief forward into a future that seemed only to drift further away from truth. What they could not know was that the answer lay not in distant highways or hidden trafficking networks, but much closer, sealed away in a cellar that had remained locked and untouched, waiting for its secret to be forced into the light. 17 years after Claire vanished, her name had become a painful memory in the town, spoken softly at vigils, but absent from everyday conversation. The case remained unsolved, locked away in a cold file, with her parents still carrying the weight of uncertainty. But time has a way of uncovering what people cannot. In 2025, an old farm just a few miles from the original market was placed up for sale, following the death of its reclusive owner. For decades, locals had whispered about the property. They said the barns were always locked, the windows blacked out. The man who lived there was rarely seen outside, and when he was, his demeanor discouraged conversation. Children passed by on bicycles daring each other to run to the porch, but no one lingered. The farm was a place that carried a quiet reputation, unsettling, avoided, but never questioned deeply enough to expose what lay beneath. When the new owners purchased the property, they intended nothing more sinister than restoring it. The land was overgrown, the structures sagging under years of neglect. They hired contractors to begin renovations, clearing brush, pulling down rotted beams, and hauling out decades of debris. As work moved toward the farmhouse, the crew descended into the cellar, expecting the usual clutter of jars and broken furniture. Instead, they found a space that felt off, unusually bare, almost sterile, with walls that didn't match the construction of the house above. Some sections were covered with fresh plaster, oddly smoother than the surrounding stone, as if someone had patched or rebuilt parts of it in secrecy. The workers noted how the cellar seemed designed to keep people out. The entrance door was heavier than typical, reinforced with multiple locks, though rusted now with age. The windows had been bricked over from the inside. There was no sign of food storage, no tools, none of the ordinary items found in a farmhouse cellar. Instead, there was emptiness, broken only by the strange alterations to the walls. One worker described the uneasy feeling of standing there, as though the air itself pressed in too tightly. Curiosity turned to concern as the team began chipping at one of the plastered sections. Behind it, they discovered layers of stone that seemed deliberately stacked, sealing off a recess in the foundation. It was a discovery that raised immediate questions. Why would someone go to such lengths to wall off part of their own cellar? And why had the previous owner never spoken of it, never allowed anyone inside, never explained the modifications that seemed so purposeful? The new owners contacted authorities, both out of safety and suspicion. Detectives arrived, walking into a space that felt frozen in time. They examined the cellar walls closely, noting the inconsistencies. The construction was crude, the materials mismatched from the rest of the foundation. It looked less like repair work and more like concealment. For investigators, it was impossible to ignore the proximity of the farm to the place where Claire had last been seen. The timing of the renovations and the long-standing reputation of secrecy around the property made the discovery feel less like coincidence and more like the surfacing of a lead that had been waiting for decades. Neighbors recalled how the old man who owned the farm never married, rarely had visitors, and seemed to take extraordinary measures to keep people away from his land. Some remembered hearing strange noises at night, hammering, dragging sounds, sometimes muffled voices, but they brushed it off, unwilling to get involved. He was considered odd but not threatening, a man who wanted solitude and was granted it. No one questioned why his barns remained locked year-round or why his cellar door was always bolted. They simply accepted it as one of the town's quiet mysteries. Now, with the cellar exposed, those memories took on a darker weight. Investigators began to map the layout of the basement, tracing the alterations, searching for hollow spaces behind the sealed sections. What began as curiosity soon shifted into a crime scene. They brought in forensic experts, ground-penetrating tools, and lights to illuminate every crack. Dust floated through the air as the plaster crumbled, each strike of a hammer raising the question of what might lie hidden inside. For Claire's family, the news of a discovery so close to the market reignited emotions they had spent years trying to control. Her father's suspicions about the community and the land near the market now seemed validated. Her mother, though terrified of what might be found, clung to the hope that at least answers might finally surface. After nearly 2 decades of silence, the investigation that had grown cold was alive again, centered on a farm whose walls now held the possibility of truth. As the plaster dust settled, it became clear that the cellar was not just a room, but a puzzle, reshaped and sealed with intention. What it contained had been hidden deliberately, preserved in darkness, while the world above continued to move on. And as investigators prepared to dismantle the first of the altered walls, the air inside the cellar grew heavier, weighted with the anticipation that something long buried and deeply disturbing was about to emerge. When the first section of the cellar wall came down, it revealed not soil or stone, but a hollow recess, carefully bricked shut as if someone had meant for it to remain hidden forever. The contractors who stumbled on it stepped back immediately, their unease quickly overtaking curiosity. They called the new owners, who in turn contacted authorities. Soon, the dim basement was crowded with detectives and forensic technicians, their gloved hands sweeping away dust, their lights cutting across rough stone and plaster. It was no longer a renovation project. It was a potential crime scene. Inside the cavity were objects that did not belong to an ordinary farmhouse. The first item pulled out was a scarf, its fabric torn, edges frayed with age. It had been pressed into the corner, dirtied by years underground, but it still carried enough color to be recognizable. Alongside it lay 2 hair barrettes, tarnished but intact, and a small collection of brass tokens marked with the emblem of the farm market. None of these items had been recorded in the old man's belongings after his death, and none made sense being sealed into a wall. Detectives moved carefully, cataloging each object, bagging them for analysis. They took photographs of the space before disturbing anything further. The realization settled quickly. These were not random keepsakes. They were personal items, preserved intentionally. Within days, Claire's parents were brought in to view the evidence. Her mother identified the scarf immediately, recalling how Claire had worn it often on breezy days, a favorite piece she had taken to the market that very morning. The barrettes were hers too, the kind she used casually to pin back strands of hair. And the market tokens, small coins used by shoppers to purchase produce, had been in her purse when she vanished. Seeing them again, dirtied and hidden behind stone, brought her mother to tears. For investigators, the discovery was the most significant break in the case in nearly 2 decades. They had physical items tied directly to Claire, concealed in the home of a man who had lived just miles from where she disappeared. Yet the find was as agonizing as it was revelatory. The scarf, the barrettes, the tokens, they proved she had been connected to the cellar, but they gave no answers about what had actually happened to her, and more painfully, no body. The absence of human remains left the case balanced on the edge of truth, suspended between proof of presence and proof of fate. News spread quickly through the town. The farm that had long been whispered about was now the center of every conversation. Neighbors who had once avoided the property out of vague unease now spoke of it with open dread. Some admitted they had always felt something was wrong about the man who lived there, though none could point to anything concrete. Others defended him as quiet but harmless, a loner who had never caused trouble. But the items sealed in the wall made those defenses difficult to sustain. The community was left reckoning with the possibility that answers had been sitting just down the road all along, concealed in a cellar no one dared question. Detectives treated the site with renewed urgency. The cellar was fully excavated, each wall tested for additional voids. Forensic teams sifted through soil samples, hoping to find bone fragments or biological traces. Specialized lights and chemical sprays were used to detect hidden stains. But despite the thoroughness of the search, no human remains surfaced. The cellar gave up its secret reluctantly, offering pieces of Claire's life without the confirmation of her death. For her parents, the discovery was both vindication and torment. It proved she had not simply walked away, had not staged her disappearance or left of her own will, theories that some had cruelly whispered over the years. She had been taken, and she had been taken here. But without her body, they could not bury her, could not close the chapter. They were left staring into the void of that cellar, wondering how long she had been inside its walls and why only her belongings had remained. The investigation, long dormant, surged back to life. Old files were reopened, interviews revisited, and witnesses tracked down after nearly 2 decades of silence. Detectives knew the discovery was not enough for a conviction, but it was enough to prove the case was far from over. Every theory about Claire's fate now bent toward the farm, the cellar, and the reclusive man who had lived above it for so many years. And as the town reeled from the shock, one question grew louder than all the rest. If the cellar could hold such secrets for 17 years, what else had been hidden inside its walls, waiting to be uncovered? Investigators, now armed with Claire's belongings pulled from the cellar wall, began the painstaking process of reconstructing the past. The first step was tracing the property itself, going back through decades of ownership records. The farmhouse and its surrounding acres had belonged to one man for over 40 years, a figure who had drifted through the community largely unnoticed. His name surfaced again and again, each document pointing back to him, each record tightening the circle around a man who had died quietly, leaving behind little more than whispers and suspicion. He had been known locally as a delivery driver for the farm market, a job that kept him on the fringes of the bustling Saturday crowds. He wasn't remembered for conversation or warmth. Most who recalled him described a man who avoided eye contact, spoke only when necessary, and seemed to prefer the background. He never married, never had children, and never appeared at church or town events. To many, he was invisible, the kind of solitary presence people grew used to ignoring. But with the Cellar discovery, investigators could no longer overlook him. His life, once dismissed as harmless reclusion, now carried the heavy shadow of possibility. Old police files were revisited, and within them, forgotten witness statements resurfaced. Among them were accounts from market-goers who recalled a dark-colored pickup truck seen parked near the lot's exit the morning Claire disappeared. At the time, the detail was noted, but never linked to anyone with certainty. Now, with the delivery driver's name in hand, investigators cross-checked records of his vehicle ownership. The match was immediate. He had driven a dark green pickup during that period, a model consistent with the truck described. One witness, interviewed again after all these years, remembered something chilling. They had noticed Claire walking toward her car, and parked only a few spaces away was the green pickup. The driver leaned against the door, smoking, watching the lot. The memory was faint, blurred by time, but when pressed, the witness admitted they had always thought the man looked familiar, like someone who worked the market. They had dismissed it back then, but with hindsight, it no longer felt insignificant. Detectives began piecing together a theory. If Claire had been lured or forced into a vehicle, it would explain why the dogs lost her scent so abruptly at the edge of the gravel lot. It would also explain the absence of struggle inside her car, the neatness of her belongings, the silence that fell so quickly after her last sighting. The possibility grew clearer with each detail. She had been taken, and she had likely been taken by someone who knew the market well enough to blend in unnoticed. The delivery driver's profile only deepened suspicion. Former co-workers described him as meticulous about routine, someone who valued control. He often volunteered to transport goods alone, preferring solitary routes. A few recalled uneasy interactions, moments where his temper flared unexpectedly, or where his questions about women at the market seemed uncomfortably specific. Yet none had considered him capable of something as dark as abduction. In the absence of evidence at the time, those anecdotes faded into the background. Now, re-examined through the lens of the Cellar discovery, the fragments aligned differently. Investigators mapped out the distances, the farm only minutes away from the market, the secluded driveway shielded by trees, the locked barns no one ever entered. The logistics made sense. If Claire had been approached, persuaded with a request for help, or overpowered quickly, she could have been driven to the farm and hidden away before anyone realized she was missing. Forensic teams searched through what remained of his possessions, but the years had erased much. The man had died alone, his personal effects minimal, his documents scattered. Yet even in the absence of confession or direct proof, the shape of the truth began to form. Investigators who had once viewed the case as a puzzle with missing pieces now saw the outline of a disturbing picture. The man's reclusion, his proximity to the market, the eyewitness accounts of his truck, and the belongings sealed in his cellar created a convergence that was difficult to ignore. For Claire's family, the knowledge was devastating. Her father had always believed the truth lay close to the market, hidden within the routines of people who had gone unnoticed. Now, that belief was substantiated, though it came too late to save her. Her mother, though shaken, found some validation in knowing that her daughter had not simply vanished into mystery. There had been a man, a place, a deliberate act. The uncertainty of 17 years narrowed into something more concrete, though still unbearably cruel. But even with the pieces aligning, investigators faced the same agonizing gap. Without Claire's body, they could not prove definitively what had happened inside that farmhouse. The cellar had given them fragments of her life, but not the final evidence of her death. The reclusive man was gone, beyond questioning, beyond justice. All that remained was the growing certainty that Claire had entered his world on that morning in 2008 and never walked out again. As detectives pressed further, they would discover that the cellar's secrets were not exhausted. The crude stone walls concealed more than just her belongings. Behind one final partition, investigators would uncover a hidden chamber, a space that revealed not only how Claire had been taken, but how she had been kept. When investigators returned to the cellar, they did so with a determination that bordered on obsession. The items already discovered had proven Claire's connection to the farm, but there was still the unsettling sense that the cellar held more. The mismatched stonework, the crude plaster patches, and the unnatural proportions of the room suggested it had been altered more than once. Detectives ordered a full excavation, instructing forensic teams to test every section of wall for hollowness. Slowly, as hammers and chisels worked their way along the far corner, another void revealed itself, this one larger, deeper, and far more deliberate than the first. Behind the wall was a concealed chamber, a room no more than 8 feet wide and 10 feet long, entirely cut off from light and air. There were no windows, no ventilation, only thick walls pressed tight around it. The space was bare, except for a thin concrete floor and a set of iron restraints bolted directly into it. The bolts were rusted, but their placement told a chilling story. This was not a cellar used for storage. It was a room built for confinement. The air inside was stale, heavy with the smell of damp stone. Forensic specialists worked in silence, documenting every inch before disturbing the scene. On the floor, they found faint stains that fluoresced under chemical testing. Samples were collected and sent to the lab. When the results came back, the confirmation was undeniable. DNA traces matched Claire. It meant she had not only been taken to the farm, but had been alive there, held beneath the house while life in the community above continued without knowledge. The discovery reframed everything investigators thought they knew about the case. This had not been a crime of impulse. It had not been a fleeting act of violence in a parking lot. The chamber revealed planning, intention, and the terrifying truth that Claire's disappearance had been part of a larger, deliberate design. Whoever built the room had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal it, ensuring that no one would stumble upon its existence while he lived. For 17 years, it had remained hidden in plain sight, an entire prison sealed just beneath the floorboards. Detectives pieced together what the chamber meant. Claire had been held here, at least for some time after the morning she vanished. The restraints suggested control, the lack of windows suggested isolation, and the DNA confirmed presence. It was a revelation that turned the case from mystery into nightmare. For her family, the idea that she had been so close, imprisoned within reach of the town that searched endlessly for her, was unbearable. The searchers had walked past the farm dozens of times, never knowing the person they sought was locked away just beneath the earth. Neighbors reflected on the oddities they had noticed over the years, the sounds of hammering in the night, the way the man never allowed anyone into his home, the fact that his cellar door remained locked no matter the season. At the time, those details had seemed eccentricities of a recluse. Now they took on a sinister clarity. The farm had not been merely a place of solitude. It had been a fortress designed to shield his secret from the world. The chamber's existence also forced investigators to reconsider the suspect himself. His quiet demeanor, his solitary lifestyle, and his limited interactions at the market had all seemed harmless. But the room suggested a man who harbored darker compulsions, someone who had not simply stumbled into crime, but had constructed an environment to sustain it. The idea of him moving through the market, carrying crates, speaking politely to vendors, all while knowing he had a hidden prisoner beneath his home, unsettled everyone who had once overlooked him. For the community, the revelation broke open old wounds. Many had clung to the belief that Claire had been taken far away, that her disappearance was the work of strangers. Learning that she had been imprisoned within walking distance of where she vanished was almost too much to accept. The market, once a symbol of neighborly trust, was now inseparably tied to a story of hidden cruelty and betrayal. Yet even with the DNA confirmation, one agonizing fact remained. Claire's body was still missing. The chamber proved captivity, but it did not reveal the end. Investigators speculated she may have been killed and moved, or that her remains were hidden deeper still within the property. Excavations extended beyond the cellar, into the barns and fields, but no grave was found. The lack of a body left the family trapped between certainty and despair, knowing what had been done but unable to lay her to rest. The discovery of the hidden room was the most chilling confirmation yet that Claire's disappearance was not random but premeditated, planned with precision and executed without witnesses. It explained why the scent trail had ended so abruptly, why her belongings had been concealed, and why her absence had haunted the town for so long. But it also left investigators facing a haunting question. If this man had built a prison beneath his home, had Claire been his only victim, or had there been others sealed away before her? The search of the farmhouse did not end with the cellar. Investigators turned their attention to the rest of the property, combing through the attic, the barns, and every locked trunk left behind after the owner's death. What they discovered in the dust of the attic floor was a collection of notebooks and journals stacked in neat piles, bound with string as if preserved intentionally. The pages were yellowed, the handwriting cramped and meticulous. At first glance, the words seemed like ramblings, but as detectives read further, a pattern emerged that chilled them to the core. The man had written extensively about control, about the idea of possession. He described the world as corrupt and undeserving, painting himself as the one entitled to keep what others failed to value. Page after page detailed fantasies of captivity, of building a space where no one could escape him. The journals were not direct confessions, but they were filled with metaphors that seemed less like imagination and more like veiled admissions. One passage, in particular, stood out. He wrote about the girl with the yellow scarf, describing how she moved through the market and how he watched her. Claire had worn her favorite yellow scarf on the day she disappeared. The more detectives read, the more the lines blurred between fantasy and record. Some entries appeared almost like observations, recounting dates, weather, and small details that corresponded eerily with the morning Claire vanished. He wrote of patience, of waiting for the right moment, of acting when no one else was paying attention. Though he never mentioned her name, the implication was undeniable. Claire was not random. She had been targeted. Forensic psychologists brought in to analyze the journals painted a disturbing profile. They described him as a silent predator, someone who fed on the isolation he had built around himself. His reclusive lifestyle had not been a quirk of personality, but a deliberate shield, allowing him to conceal darker compulsions. He blended into the background, never drawing attention, so that when he acted, no one would suspect him. The journals revealed not rage or impulse, but obsession, a methodical desire to possess, to hide, to erase someone from the world above, and keep them in the darkness below. Investigators looked back on his years as a delivery driver for the market and saw his access in a new light. He knew the schedules, the vendors, the families who came each week. He moved in and out of the market without question, his presence so routine it became invisible. That invisibility gave him the perfect opportunity. On the morning Claire vanished, no one questioned him standing near the lot, no one noticed his gaze, and no one saw her being led or forced into his vehicle. The journal suggested it had not been a sudden act, but the culmination of years of planning and fixation. The entries also revealed a philosophy that unsettled even seasoned detectives. He wrote of believing that by keeping someone, he was rescuing them from a world that did not deserve them. He cast himself not as a villain, but as a savior in his own mind. This distorted reasoning explained the chamber beneath his farmhouse. It was not built merely to hide someone, but to preserve them in a way he considered righteous. For investigators, it reframed the horror. Claire had not only been abducted, she had been taken by someone who believed he was justified, someone who likely never felt guilt for what he had done. Her family was shown excerpts of the journals. For her father, the words were unbearable proof that his suspicions about people close to the market had been right all along. For her mother, they were a final cruelty, transforming the memory of her daughter's scarf into the image of her being watched, catalogued, and chosen. The confirmation that she had been specifically targeted deepened their grief, but it also silenced years of rumors that she might have run away or left willingly. The journals made clear she had no choice. The town, too, was forced to reckon with the reality. The man they had ignored, the one whose silence and distance they had dismissed as harmless, had in fact used that invisibility to mask something monstrous. Neighbors remembered seeing him at the market, helping load crates, exchanging brief nods, and never once suspected he carried within him the intent to build a hidden prison beneath his home. It forced an uncomfortable reckoning. How well do we ever really know the people living beside us? Even with the cellar, the DNA, and the journals, one piece remained missing: Claire herself. Investigators now had overwhelming circumstantial evidence, enough to piece together the truth of her abduction and captivity, but without her remains, the story remained incomplete. The cellar had proven what was done to her, the journals had revealed why, but the final chapter, where she was now, still eluded them. And yet, buried within the man's writings were hints that more remained concealed. He wrote cryptically about the silence of walls and the place no one will ever look. Detectives could not ignore the possibility that his words pointed to another hiding place, another chamber, or another secret left behind on that farm. The journals made one thing clear. What had already been uncovered was only part of a larger, far more disturbing design. The investigation reached its end not with a body, but with the weight of evidence too overwhelming to deny. The cellar, the hidden chamber, the DNA, and the journals all told the same story. Claire had been taken, held, and ultimately lost beneath the floorboards of a farmhouse no one had ever questioned. 17 years of rumor, speculation, and unanswered questions narrowed into one grim truth. She had not vanished into thin air, and she had not run away. She had been imprisoned in silence by a man who lived quietly among them, a man no one thought to fear. For the detectives who had carried her file across different desks for nearly 2 decades, the discovery was bittersweet. It brought resolution, but not the kind anyone wanted. Without remains, there would be no autopsy, no precise determination of when her life ended. There would be no charges filed, because the man responsible was already dead, his secrets left to be uncovered only after his passing. What they had was confirmation without consequence, and though the evidence was clear, justice could never truly be served. The community struggled to absorb the truth. For years, neighbors had whispered about strangers or transient workers, always believing the threat had come from outside. To learn that the danger had lived just down the road, in a farmhouse they passed daily, was shattering. Some blamed themselves for not speaking up sooner, recalling the oddities they had noticed: the locked barns, the strange noises, the way he never allowed anyone near his cellar. Others admitted they had dismissed him as nothing more than a recluse, someone harmless in his solitude. Now they faced the uncomfortable realization that the signs had always been there, hiding in plain sight. For Claire's family, the news confirmed the nightmare they had carried in their hearts but had never wanted to name. The scarf, the barrettes, the tokens, the DNA in the hidden room, they were enough to prove she had suffered and died there. Her father's long-held suspicion that the market and its surrounding farms held the answers was validated, though in the cruelest way possible. Her mother, who had kept hope alive all those years, was left to grieve not only her daughter's death, but also the knowledge of what she endured. They finally had truth, but it was a truth that deepened their pain rather than eased it. The cellar itself became a symbol, not just of the crime, but of the silence that had surrounded it. For nearly 2 decades, people had searched fields, rivers, and highways, imagining her far away. All the while, the answer was beneath the ground they stood on, sealed away in a chamber built for captivity. The revelation forced the town to confront how easily darkness can hide beneath the ordinary, how a man buying bread at the market, offering polite nods, could harbor a secret prison beneath his home. The case was formally closed, the file marked with a resolution that lacked finality. Law enforcement could prove where she had been and what had been done, but not where she lay. The absence of her body left her family with no place to mourn, no grave to visit, only the knowledge that she had been buried forever in secrecy. The cellar walls had hidden her fate, and even in death, they kept her from being fully returned to the people who loved her. For the wider community, the truth was both an ending and a haunting. It silenced the rumors of her running away or starting a new life. It put to rest the theories of trafficking or chance encounters, but it replaced them with something even more disturbing: the knowledge that she had been chosen, confined, and killed by someone who stood beside them unnoticed. The farm that had long carried whispers of unease now stood as a monument to the horror they had all overlooked. And so, the story of Claire did not conclude with closure, but with confirmation. She had been there all along, hidden in darkness, while her family and community searched in vain. The farmhouse cellar, once just another locked door in a quiet town, revealed the truth that had been buried for 17 years. It was not the resolution her family prayed for, but it was the reality they had always feared, that what they had lost could never be returned, and that the secret of her disappearance had been concealed beneath their feet the entire time.